So, going back beyond slavery, you're saying, to draw on this information?
Yeah, so we began to understand that somehow, if we were going to understand who we were as the norm, we had to look at ourselves as Africans prior to the Ma'afa, prior to the disruption of our cultural definitions of ourselves. So we then,
Can you just describe what you mean by Ma'afa?
oh yes, the Ma'afa. The Ma'afa has to do, it's a concept that was phrased by Mama Marimba Ani, a Swahili concept that really has to do with a serious Holocaust disaster. And it was somehow the effort to try to describe the upheaval, the social, historical, personal upheaval that African people went through in the disruption of our culture. And so we then became, in many ways, a product of that upheaval once we were brought into captivity. So we had to go back prior to the upheaval so that we could begin to understand who we were. So as we began then to kind of reconstruct an understanding of who we were, we then tried to go back to understand what was traditional Africa about all along. Now, simultaneously, while this was going on in our intellectual enterprise, I was also trying to find out how I fit into that. I was raised as a good little middle class colored boy who somehow had gone to this wonderful Midwestern university thinking and believing that white people had the answer because they were the ones who had the norm for excellence. So the idea of being able to be one of a few at a place like the University of Michigan that were kind of the reigning voice in terms of the understanding of psychology, there was a disappointment when I got there and couldn't find the answers to our questions. So I was able to have enough sense that there was not, and it wasn't just me. It wasn't, I had this kind of independent perception. It was this noise, this cultural upheaval that was taking place outside. It was all of the questioning that was going on. It was the riots that were taking place in the U.S. It was the fact that there was a growing discontent with the answers that we'd been given. Historians were beginning to ask different kinds of questions. As I said, the artists were beginning to ask different kinds of questions. And so with all of that taking place outside, it led to a questioning within myself. You know, am I this thing that I have been socialized to become? And I found out that there was a real dissatisfaction with that. So as I moved towards the end of my formal training at the university, raising these kinds of questions about whether or not what I was learning was answering what I needed to answer. And as I began to look for a paradigm or look for an environment where we had normality, I was looking for normality for myself. And it was during this time that I became exposed to the autobiography of Malcolm X. I became exposed to the writings of James Baldwin. I became exposed to many of the nationalist writings. And interestingly enough, once I began teaching at the university where I was, I began to encounter, interestingly enough, students who taught me that I didn't have the answers that I needed.
And how old were you at this time?
I was a young professor. I finished my PhD at 25 years old. Yeah, so I was still very young myself. So my colleagues, who were my fellow professors, were still my elders, and my students were more my contemporaries.
That's very young. 25.
Yes, I completed my PhD at 25. And so I began teaching at Morehouse College, an historically black college. And so the students were asking many of the same kinds of questions. So we were exploring together. So with my students, I was exploring answers to questions that I didn't have as a professor, because my colleagues didn't have those answers because they were still teaching another mindset. And that was how I became interested in, became intrigued by, and really was intrigued by and simultaneously frightened of the way that the kind of transformation that had to take place, because all of my assumptions had to be challenged in terms of that. So for an example, one of the ways that I began to find out, begin to explore how the Nation of Islam was doing what it was doing, how a Malcolm had gone from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X, was I sent my students to explore.
On your behalf.
On my behalf, exactly. I said, you go to the mosque and kind of listen to what they're talking about. Find out what what's going on there. Exactly. I wouldn't go because I was really kind of intimidated by the fact that was an entirely different way of understanding the world.
Just to unpack that intimidation element of it, did you, because I know I experienced it myself,
right?
Experience this background noise of negativity in association with these individuals and these organizations that left you feeling that it wasn't the place to go?
Yeah.
A safe place to go.
Well,
there was these people, they were, if not evil, at the very least dysfunctional.
Yeah, very much dysfunctional, because I meant I was still in a context. I was going to a middle-class Baptist college. I was teaching in a middle-class Baptist college, that somehow those black Muslims were viewed as being demonic people who were possessed by this very strange thing and a part of this cult, if you will.
That's the word.
It was a cult out there. And I didn't want to go anywhere near a cult. I was too intelligent to be involved with that. But the paradox is that this cult was being more successful in making the kinds of changes in those parts of our community that needed change than was the mainstream acceptable avenues for doing so. So when you talk about reforming prisons, when you talk about reforming drug addicts, when you talk about building families that were falling apart, when you begin to talk about addressing the economic needs that we had as a community to be able to do something besides beg, but do something for ourselves. When you begin to talk about how do you begin to address the social problems that we were facing as a community, that I was supposed to be an expert at, and found out that I was less equipped to address those problems than this cult was able to do. And that was the thing that generated the curiosity. But the intimidation was that it still was being translated through the mainstream, middle class, black and white press, interpreting what that experience was all about. So that's why there was this intimidation, you know. But as time went on, though, and sort of like as I was able to get entree through my students who went as my emissaries, I began to explore myself. And then I began to find that in order to actually bring about the kind of change that was necessary, it was going to require a paradigm shift in terms of my thinking. And one of the things that was going on in the nation, in the Black Panthers, in many of the other nationalist organizations, is that there was a real kind of paradigm shift. We were beginning to think of ourselves differently. And one of the things that was going on in the Nation of Islam that I'd gotten a glimpse of as I'd read the autobiography of Malcolm X was that somehow you had to begin to redefine who you were in order to begin to address your issues in a meaningful kind of way. Okay? So, this was the personal thinking that was being transformed at the same time